You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum.
Hello, welcome to Precinct 444, the podcast of the National Law Enforcement Museum. I'm Josh Bronson, Director of Education, Programs, and Visitor Experience, and today we're taking a thoughtful and deeply important look at one of the most persistent and dangerous forms of hate, antisemitism. I'm joined today by Oren Segal, Senior Vice President of Counter-Extremism and Intelligence at the Anti-Defamation League. I'm going to restart that sentence. I'm joined by Oren Segal, Senior Vice President of Counter-Extremism and Intelligence at the Anti-Defamation League. Oren brings decades of experience tracking extremist movements, monitoring emerging threats, and supporting law enforcement in understanding how hate evolves and how it can be prevented. Together, we'll explore the long history of anti-Semitism, how old prejudices have taken on new forms in the digital age, and what the recent global rise in anti-Semitic incidents means for community safety. We'll also discuss what law enforcement can do practically and proactively to build trust, identify early warning signs, and strengthen partnerships with Jewish communities. This is a critical conversation for anyone committed to protecting the public and countering hate in all its forms. Oren, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
So let's start by tracing the roots of anti-Semitism. This is, a word that we hear thrown around quite a bit, and I just want to make sure we're all sort of on the same page as we start. So, what are the roots of anti-Semitism? What can you tell us about the historical patterns that continue to inform threats today?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the roots of anti-Semitism are deep, right, and go as far back as there are Jews. I think the question that a lot of people have, these days is what we're seeing today, altogether different from what we've seen in the past, or is it really more of a continuation? And when we look at some, classic anti-Semitic stereotypes that have animated violence against the Jewish community over centuries, or that have created suspicion or anger, et cetera. I mean, there are these common themes that come up, right? That includes the Jews being, different or clannish, not being trusted, being more loyal to themselves than the societies in which they live in. Then there's kind of more outrageous stereotypes of, Jews drinking the blood of Christians, children, right? These were kind of classic stereotypes. They were the original memes, if you will, the original conspiracy theories that led people to have mistrust and to stereotype the community. In many ways, the idea that Jews are about themselves or greedy or have too much power or, choose your own adventure of conspiracy theory, they're still animating a lot of the anti-Semitism today. How it is communicated, what it looks like, how it's, migrates from different online platforms, how it animates real world activity is actually probably in many ways the same as it was before. It's just in a modern world. So I guess that's my long-winded way of saying when we think of anti-Semitism today, many of the tropes are actually tried and true and have been around for millennia.
Yeah, that's so fast. Especially you talk about the memes, right? The memes of the past. I mean, I remember being in in places like the Holocaust Museum, the National Holocaust Museum, and seeing the anti-Semitic pictures and things like that. And you're right, they were just the memes of the past, right? They're it's just an older version of that was shared around and really perpetuated those stereotypes. So it's a really interesting framing of it. That's just they can be shared more widely today, right? At the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, even some of the imagery itself, right? If you look at, I don't know, choose whatever platform is your favorite today. I'm sure it's filled with it. And then look at like Die Stürmer cartoons in Germany, they look the same. And then, go back several hundred years before that and see what kind of propaganda was being created. I mean, there really is a through line, and it's all about like distrust, suspicion, and looking for convenient stereotypes and convenient targets for all the evils of the world, right? The Jews have always been there to take those body blows.
Yeah. Well, and when you talk about those types of, body blows, to use your words, I mean, certainly October 7th, 2023, that was a real moment in time that the Jewish community won't forget soon. So, how did what we saw happen? When we think about October 7th, and the attacks by Hamas on Israel, how did those attacks really impact global anti-Semitic activity, and what surges have you observed recently in the aftermath of those attacks?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I do think many people, including many folks within the Jewish community, have this kind of before October 7th and after October 7th worldview. But the reality is this, like the reactions and the anti-Semitism, which I'll talk about in a second, to that, massacre and that tragedy, were not spontaneous. This didn't come out of nowhere. Much of the rhetoric that we saw, whether it was at protests around the world, the reaction online that essentially like blamed Jews for their own victimhood, right? I say Jews because a lot of this language wasn't just about Israel and politics or what the government or military was doing. There was this like jump to all Jews are somehow representative of everything that the Israeli government does. That was not new. We had been tracking that. I've been at ADL for over 20 years. This is something that I've been, looking at and studying and responding to in all that time. So, this was something that had been incubating in online spaces, on and off campus, in the minds of anti-Semites and elsewhere as well. But, that being said, just the level of whether it was coordinated online or, just kind of opportunistic, the level of anti-Semitism that October 7th released was shocking, if not surprising, right? So you would think at a time where the Jewish community had just suffered a really traumatic experience, seeing the horrible images and from Israel, you think that there would have been even just for a moment, some sympathy, kind of let's pause for a second. But actually what it did was it seemed to spark for many an opportunity to promote their hatred. And, one of the things that we have seen kind of to put some data around this post October 7th is in the year 2024, right? So the full year of 24, we do an audit of anti-Semitic incidents that, incidents of harassment, vandalism, and assault are reported to us. And it was, over 9,000 incidents, the highest number we had ever recorded. There had been a steady stream of years of this increase. But what was notable is that 58% of the anti-Semitic incidents that we had documented featured some sort of reference to Israel or Zionism. And so I want to be clear, it's not criticism of Israel. I mean, I'm Israeli, by the way, and I know a lot of people that are critical of the Israeli government policies, or, you don't have to all, despite what some people think, we don't all think the same way, whether we're Jews or Israelis. And criticism is as much of a part of, the culture as anything else. But this wasn't just kind of criticism of Israel. It was protests in front of synagogues, essentially ascribing blame on all Jews for the actions of the state. That's where we saw these lines being crossed. And at protests, where there were over 5,000, 6,000 protests in the first year after the October 7th massacre, you know, half of them half of them featured expressions of anti-Semitism. It's not that the protests were anti-Semitic. There were a lot of people there who, were against the war or who had other issues, right? It's not everybody who showed up wasn't a problem. But, in at least half of them, there were these expressions that were targeting the Jewish community, normalizing violence against Jews in a way that, like, just wasn't as brazen at that volume and at that tenor that we had seen before. And I think that was the big difference post October 7th. And it's been hard to put that back and to make it become more fringe. It's just kind of part of our everyday. And I think that's why many in the Jewish community still feel vulnerable, over 2 years later.
And I think that's a really important point that you just brought up too about, the difference between, it's not that if you protest, Israel or the war, anything like that, that doesn't inherently make an incident anti-Semitic. I think that's a really important point. It's what was occurring during some of the protests, to your point, that really made it into one of those incidents that would be reported, whether it was a hate bias type incident or a hate crime, rising to the level of hate crime. I think that's a really important distinction, and one that gets lost very often in our world, that is, not meant for much nuance anymore. It's hard to have conversations with people, especially if you have to, do it online, where the nuance becomes lost. And so if you can have these conversations and listen to people like yourself, explain that, look, you can go to a protest. Like, there are people in the US that, and not to get political, because it doesn't matter who the leader of the country is or what party's in charge. There are people that always, have differences with the government in the US. It doesn't mean that everybody in a place feels a certain way all the time, and is representative of the government 100% of the time.
Yeah, and I think, like, the examples that are kind of, I think, illustrate that best is when we saw, like, restaurants that were either owned by Israelis or Jews being protested, as if in the back where they're making the food, they have the secret phone where they're calling in airstrikes. I mean, are you kidding me? Like, and the Jewish community has a wide variety of opinions about policy, whether it's in America or overseas. But, like, for those who were targeting them, just the fact that they were Jewish or the fact that they were Israeli made them, like, automatically part of what these folks viewed as the opposition. That is classic anti-Semitism in many cases. And for me, I operate in really dark spaces for over 20 years, right? You're not the head of our Center on Extremism and without seeing terrible things all day long. And yet when I saw people tearing down posters of, like, hostages, of, like, child hostages, like, what was that all about? I actually wasn't prepared for that, despite all the dark places I am in. And so it was almost like a denial of suffering, where, like, the Jews were not able to suffer in that case. And I found that just profoundly impactful and horrible. And, listen, I think at some point we'll talk about the good news of, like, how we're dealing with these issues. But yeah, that was a moment that was hard.
Well, along those lines, you mentioned the work, over your career there at ADL, and so I'm sort of curious, how has your work monitoring, exposing, disrupting anti-Semitic and extremist threats changed, especially with the growth and weaponization of things like social media? I mentioned social media before, and all sorts of online spaces and communities, and how are the bad actors using these spaces in ways that maybe they haven't done before, but or recruiting more people. Can you just share some examples of your work in those spaces?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm old enough now that I can say back in the day, and it actually means something that was pretty recent. But, back in the day, you know, there's always been anti-Semitism. There's always been, groups whose main agenda has been to promote it, those who want to harm the Jewish community. But when I first started, like, there were newspaper clippings, there were the early days of the internet, which were immediately used to promote all sorts of hatred, of course. And yes, well, even when I started, there was the internet, folks, so I'm not that old. But it was a little bit more, I would say, contained and fringe. There weren't as many platforms. That's number one. There wasn't as easy. It wasn't as easy to access any type of subculture, whether hateful or not, than there is today. And I don't know how else to say this, and this may not be 100% accurate from all perspectives, but there was just a little bit more shame. Mm-hmm. Like if you were caught or found out to be an anti-Semite or a racist or any type of bigot, there were some like consequences associated with that in just kind of like, it's not even just polite society, but society, right? I don't even know what polite society means because it doesn't exist anymore. I think that's what has changed, is that, one can create a massive following with total ease, using technology to amplify this hatred and not have consequences. In fact, be able to build, empires, raise money, encourage and animate people to action. I mean, anti-Semitism, as a form of entertainment is kind of a weird thing for people to wrap their head around. But like, I look and see what some of these anti-Semites and extremists are doing, and they are performing their anti-Semitism because they know that it's a way to engage with people, to create an audience and to get support. And that just wasn't possible, technologically when we first started, or when I first started. So that has been the challenge. And I think maybe if I was to point to like what one of these end results is in 2026, which is there's a whole cottage industry of influencers, who have millions of views and hundreds of thousands of followers, who are just brazen about their anti-Semitism. By the way, across the ideological spectrum, this is not a left-right thing, right? This is not a political thing. And who have I would say, an outsized impact on our public discussion and have normalized various types of anti-Semitism through their own popularity. I mean, that to me is still very troubling. And one last point on this. Mm-hmm. As bad as anti-Semitism is and has always been, I think what these influencers have done is almost make it more difficult for people to even recognize what anti-Semitism is, because they normalize it so much. And to me, that's quite dangerous as well.
Absolutely. Well, and to the extent that it's sort of always been true. I mean, in law enforcement circles, we certainly know that if it did the old saying, if it bleeds, it leads, right? Especially referring to legacy media and the newscast, local newscasts, the murders always made, headlines first and things. And so I think, to your point, that, influencers and folks have found new ways to capitalize on people's outrage and anger and, just all of these things. I mean, we know that it's true that, the idea of, if something is really bad, people will click on it more quickly than they will on something that's really good and positive. And unfortunately, that's sort of always been the case, right?
We vote every day with our clicks and our views and our likes, our shares, or whatever platform that you're on. And, what's the disincentive from promoting and normalizing anti-Semitism if your goal is to get those digital cues? We haven't really found a way to, again, it's not shame, but to effectively, I think push back. And I think it's influencing like so much of our discussion even today. Like I can't tell you, there's no either current event that is big news or something really small and insignificant that I can't find a whole bunch of anti-Semites blaming the Jews for it. You know what I mean? and like, I don't know how great of critical thinkers we are developing in the world, the younger audience who, really requires some guidance, and, they are inundated with this. They're not even asking for it, and they're inundated. And I think, one of the challenges we have is how do we create resilience and awareness so people can identify it? Because I do believe fundamentally that some of this is going to be attractive to people no matter what. But for those who felt like, oh, I am being taken advantage of and being sold this hatred and this anti-Semitism and being manipulated, if they felt that and they knew that, maybe they would, be more apt to not buy into it.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, today it's hard to tell what's true or not even today, right? I mean, you have AI deep fakes and, all sorts of different, new media, even on top of, the things that are still around, like memes and, things like that are shared. Now you have videos where, people can look like they're engaged in any sort of behavior at any point in time, throughout history, all of human history. And there are going to be people that view those videos, deep fakes and things, and believe that they're true, and regardless of how old somebody is, right? And I feel like that's just a whole nother level on this at this point.
Well,
Combating us.
it is a whole nother level, but this was something that, a particular area we're leaning into. We know that like LLMs or, AI or, whether it's Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT or whatever it is that, people are using to get answers for everyday questions, to build their worldview. We know that those LLMs are being trained on a corpus of information that features a lot of misinformation and disinformation, conspiracy theory, and anti-Semitism. So what we're doing is actually testing these LLMs and, putting prompts and then giving these companies the information of our findings so that they can hopefully create, more responsible, safer environments so that they could give their users the truth, not the truth based on a foundation of lies. And that's really important. That's one of the things that we're doing, whether that's video creation apps, whether that's, again, like LLMs. Ultimately, though, we can be experts in this and be effective in our outreach, but it really is up to the companies themselves about what their values are and how much do they want to put people ahead of their profits.
And just for our listener, LLM, large language model, we're going to go into we're going to do another episode on AI at some point here very shortly. So look forward to that.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. Open now, without warning. Ending the Terror of the DC Snipers is the museum's latest exhibit that immerses visitors in those haunting weeks and the extraordinary investigation that followed. See the modified Chevy Caprice used by the gunman, the rifle that terrorized the region, photos of the victims, and hear chilling 911 recordings. The exhibit captures the tension, uncertainty, and human costs of the attacks back in October of 2002. Get your tickets using the link in the episode description. And now, back to the show.
But as far as law enforcement goes, and certainly, as we're recording this, we're in the early days of the war in Iran. So what global trends currently, should law enforcement really be paying attention to, watching, trying to cue on?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two answers, and I'll try to be short here. The first is the work that we do every single day in the Center on Extremism is to try to identify not just kind of anti-Semitism and its spread, that's important, but like those who pose a threat to our community. And when there are moments of increasing anti-Semitism in online spaces, then, it may, have an impact on those who actually want to do harm. So our ability to detect those that want to do harm to us is one way, and our ability to provide that to law enforcement, right? If we see something, we say something. We give it to law enforcement for them to investigate to see if there's anything there. And we have had some success in flagging items that has ultimately enabled and helped law enforcement protect our community. So that's one thing that is always on the rise during conflict in the Middle East, kind of threats against the Jewish community in online spaces. The second, it's not as kind of blatant in terms of, oh, I want to kill Jews or, other language like that. But it's the kind of rhetorical trends and conspiracies that are created out of conflict. So already, we issued a short kind of piece about this a couple days ago, and we're about 2 weeks into the war during this recording. Of Americans are dying for Israel, right? Again, this is not illegal speech. This is not a speech that is making a threat. But the idea that Americans are dying for another country, the way that that is framed could upset people and maybe make them want to lash out against the Jewish community, right? We've seen allegations of, Jews or Zionists are controlling our government, manipulating our government into this conflict, as if the United States government, the administration, doesn't have a say in this, right? Again, the all-powerful Jew, that classic conspiracy coming to life today. And very kind of explicitly, we've seen this Operation Epstein Fury, renaming the Epic Fury, the name of this conflict or military operation, and to combine it with Epstein conspiracy theories that, essentially, Jews are trying to make people forget about, the other ills that the community is responsible for, protecting the elites and so on and so forth. I mean, in some ways, again, this is not surprising and it's not illegal. But I do think the more that this is out there, the more that it is normalized, the more that like public figures start leaning into these conspiracy theories, I think that creates a much more dangerous environment for the Jewish community. And I do think it's important for law enforcement, who is there to protect all communities, to be aware of that.
When you talk about, you've mentioned it a couple times. I mean, there's obviously speech, right? That's, can be protected, where people can express their views on a particular topic. But then, when it moves into that more violent anti-Semitic behavior, what are some of the key indicators that law enforcement in particular should be looking for, when it comes to indicators that a community or individual is moving into down that path of more violent type behavior?
It's a really hard question, because when you look at, even if you just look at attacks against the Jewish community over the past couple of years, of which unfortunately there have been many, whether it's in Boulder, Colorado, or Washington, D.C. recently, or in the last year, or, in Pittsburgh, or, in Poway, or, certainly different places around the globe, like in Australia. I mean, the question is it the narrative that is responsible for motivating these people to violence? Or is that just part of the story, right? What do each individual who carries out these attacks, what is happening in their lives, right? That may make them more likely or susceptible, more likely to maybe do an attack, or more susceptible to the type of conspiracies that may animate them, right? I mean, one of the things I'm leery of is saying, if you see these 4 things, be careful. It just doesn't work that way. And so there are some things that we can kind of account for. So if I see, the team sees somebody online saying, we're going to go do harm to this person or this institution in this place, and they have a whole bunch of images of weapons and showing the ability to do that, like, okay, that's an indicator. And, I think law enforcement would need to make decisions on whether there's enough there or not. Because believe it or not, a lot of people post that stuff, and I'm not sure that they would actually commit it, right? But like, do we have a luxury to ignore it? It's complicated. And law enforcement agencies, I think in general, have a set of criteria that they go by in terms of, what they will respond to. Our job at ADL is, if we think there's a either specific threat or a credible threat that is not specific, we just want to make sure we're providing that to the appropriate law enforcement agencies so that they can follow up. I also am a little leery of talking too much about what we're seeing that triggers that, in case one of these bad guys is listening to your podcast, and I'm sure a couple are.
So, as far as, the relationship that ADL has with law enforcement, you all have developed a really, it's been strategic, developing really great working relationships with law enforcement. I feel like, having seen those relationships develop over time and being part of helping build them in, some places that I've worked, I want to just sort of touch on, how does ADL, build those relationships and why are those relationships so important? And what can law enforcement do that might be listening that don't have relationships with ADL that, want access to, hearing from you all when, you might be have a threat identified and having that really great dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, so listen, whether it's local, state, or federal level law enforcement agencies, we've had longstanding relationships with them because we are in the communities that they are protecting, right, around the country. And in terms of strategies that we recommend, um, law enforcement agencies use to partner with Jewish organizations or other faith communities, right? It's not just about ADL, but it's other Jewish organizations or faith communities more broadly, is, meeting and getting to know the people in your local Jewish community or your religious leaders, encouraging like open and direct lines of communication, and that trust is really important. So if something does happen, you already have that relationship that can help navigate that crisis or that moment. And several cities have established you know groups of law enforcement and community leaders that convene and discuss incidents and trends. I think that's helpful. Like, we've done that with our throughout our regional offices around the country. And I think it really makes a difference to have that relationship and to let people know kind of what you're seeing. And I think that helps educate law enforcement, and then they can take whatever steps they need to. Um, an anecdote here maybe is when the anti-Semitic murders took place in front of the Capitol Jewish Museum in D.C. Right, this was last May. Within a short period of time, the D.C. police chief reached out to ADL because she knew that there was going to be an impact on the Jewish community. We had a relationship, and then we also helped in the days that followed in creating this kind of opportunity to bring together like 100 Jewish community leaders from across the city, along with the FBI Washington field office, local law enforcement, where they were able to speak directly to each other, take questions, address concerns. That type of relationship building is really meaningful in a time of crisis, and you have to build it before the crisis happens.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to meet people for lunch and, develop those relationships and, break bread. And, you don't want to be meeting somebody for the first time, certainly in the middle of a crisis.
For sure, for sure.
So, as far as frontline officers and, agencies themselves, there's a lot of obviously training and things that go into in policy development that can be used to help mitigate some anti-Semitic threats. So what sort of innovative training and resources does ADL offer? I know, for example, you're part of developing and still implementing the law enforcement and society class in partnership with law enforcement, and running that class through the U.S. Holocaust Museum, the heat map that you all have, you mentioned the audit of anti-Semitic incidents and things like that. So what are some of those things in a little bit more detail? I know I sort of gave away some of them right there, but
Great.
And how and why should law enforcement participate in those?
Yeah, I mean, so one of, I think, the most innovative training or educational offerings that we have is our law enforcement society, which I know you're very, very well, right? It's lessons of the Holocaust. It's run in partnership with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and in it, participants examine the history of the Holocaust, the role that police officers had under the Nazis, and the implications of the Holocaust for law enforcement today, focusing on kind of what we were talking about, the relationship with the people that they serve and the values that they have. And, how did it go wrong, right, in Nazi Germany? And what are those lessons there? And so many people, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of various different agencies have gone through this. It's very powerful for them because it's a universal message. It's actually not just about, protecting the Jewish community. It's about core values of democracy and what it means. And I think that's been an incredible offering that we have. And obviously, going through the Holocaust Memorial Museum is a great way to kind of learn more about that. But, in addition to that, we do provide educational opportunities on, the current state of extremism and antisemitism, hate crime training. And hate crime training is really, really important because, officers will learn to identify key elements of what is a hate crime and what is not, how to, strengthen their kind of understanding of the legal framework, how to sharpen skills as they're investigating and documenting bias motivated crimes. These are a little bit different, right? And then also deepening their appreciation of the importance of preventing hate crime. Listen, at the end of the day, too, like reporting hate crime is really important. And there's still a lot of law enforcement agencies that are not doing that. And so we know that as hate crime statistics come out every year from the FBI or from local law enforcement agencies around the country, they're often not even the full data, and yet the numbers are really high. And so part of what we are encouraging folks is like to give us a better picture of that. Because when we know what the trends are, when we have the full data, we can work, with all parts of society to start finding ways to kind of push back against that hatred and secure the community better.
Well, and I just want to go back to the law enforcement and society class real quickly too, because that class I've been through both the in-person and the virtual versions of that class, and in talking to others from police officers, police leaders from around the country, from all different types of agencies, from major cities to rural agencies to small campus agencies to whatever type of agency it is, everybody comes away from that class completely changed. It's such a deeply impactful class, and I think I didn't have a full understanding of it, I think, until I actually started working at the law enforcement museum, the National Law Enforcement Museum, because a museum is such an interesting place to actually train people, where it's not just about the history. It becomes it puts everything into context, and you can actually contextualize it in a way that you can't do just sitting in a class learning about anti-Semitism or whatever the topic might be, right? In my case, law enforcement history, right? It's such a different conversation when you're actually there, experiencing it and having that experiential learning. And I think that's one of the reasons why it connects with people, regardless of their background, regardless of what type of law enforcement they are. I think that's what makes that class in particular such a powerful experience for people.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the other element of it that has always struck me is that sure, this is designed for law enforcement agencies, but it's a very like human story,
Yeah.
right? And like the lessons of the Holocaust again are can be applied to so many parts of our lives. I mean, we also do this, in educational settings with, students, right? The non-law enforcement, where, part of the lesson of the Holocaust is, not to be an innocent bystander when you see the type of, not just injustice, but horror being happening. And again, that's not a Jewish story. That's a human story that is coming out of that experience. And I do think that I've been with law enforcement a lot over the years, and a lot of times not everybody loves to go to another training and another whatever, but this is really different because I think it's meeting them as human beings, not just as law enforcement, but reminding them what it means when they are part of an organization like that.
I think that's such an important part of it as well. One of the things that I talk to law enforcement groups that come to the museum about is shared humanity, for example, as we're going around touring the museum. And, it's that connection to, yes, people might think of you as the other, right? Whatever that looks like, right? And so in context of law enforcement, right, that you're different somehow, you're law enforcement, you don't feel, and people have all these misconceptions about what that means. But once you get down to it, we all want the same things at the end of the day. We want our family, our friends to be safe and secure, and I think if we can have more of those types of conversations, I think that makes a huge difference in the world that we're living in. Because like I mentioned before, I think too much of what we do nowadays is a lack of nuanced conversation and a lack of understanding, a lack of listening with empathy, for whatever the other person is going through. And I think that if we intentionally create these types of settings, I think it goes a long way with helping society.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I like that, we even in this conversation, Josh, are talking about pretty dark topics. And yet I hope you don't sense it in my voice and I don't sense it in yours. Like, I'm not feeling hopeless. Like, I have a lot of like um successes that we're seeing in terms of our ability to impact some of what we're talking about, the knowledge that there are partners in society that are meant to protect us from this, including and especially law enforcement, right? Being able to use institutions to help further that, whether it's the Holocaust Memorial Museum or institutions like ADL. I mean, to me, like, we tend to, as you kind of said earlier, focus on the bad and the negative and the horrible. But there are a lot of inspiring stories of how the Jewish community, our institutions, our law enforcement are meeting this moment. And by the way, folks who are listening, like, I know it may not be the first thing on your feed on your social media, but scratch the surface a little bit and you'll find it. And I do think it's part of our job to remind people that if not for us, things could be worse. If not for the partnerships that are happening, like, it could be a lot worse. And I just hope people recognize that whether it's these types of programs or just kind of the work that organizations like ADL and others do, it is fundamentally built on hope. And that hope stands because we're seeing that we are actually able, despite it all, have some success in a very complicated time.
No, I love that. And I think it is challenging, right? It is challenging to have hope. And this isn't, meant for any one part of the world we're living in, even, right? I mean, it's, if you're talking about law enforcement, there's a lot of hopelessness feeling and helplessness, that law enforcement officers feel about various things. Certainly within the Jewish community and, the topics we've talked about today, but there are a lot of communities, regardless of who they are, that feel hopeless in one way, shape, or form. But I do think that you're right. I mean, if you, what is it? You look for the helpers, right? And, I think that, that's why I always start off, talking to law enforcement groups in particular too, asking them what their why is. Why did they join this profession, right? And by and large, almost across the board, regardless again of what type of agency they work for, or where they work in the world for that matter, it's because they want to help people, in some way, shape, or form, and that's a really noble thing. And I think that work in being able to work with organizations like ADL, and others, that work on different issues. I think there is a lot of hope that we can sort of take away, that there are people that want to help. They just need the tools and resources to be able to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I know this is your podcast and you're the interviewer, but what is your why?
My why is and it's very typical. Why? Because I wanted to help people.
Yeah.
I was the little kid that wouldn't go anywhere without his Superman cape. For and, Superman's still my favorite superhero. But it's that idea of giving, providing protection to people that can't, or for whatever reason. It's not because maybe they can't physically or anything like that. It's just that for whatever reason they're in a position where can't protect themselves, right? And that they can't, be in that sort of a role. And so the idea of being able to provide that, I think, is one of the most noble things that somebody can do, a mitzvah, if you will, and so I think that, I think the more that we get back to those sorts of ideas of reminding police officers and others why they got into professions that want to help people, I think we can make a real difference. And that's why I always start off the conversation that way with law enforcement, because I never want them to forget that why, because it is so important. And there are plenty of other, sorts of organizations out there that want to help, right? ADL, the work that you all do. I mean, you talk about the darkest things that you've seen, right? There's a reason you do that. It's not because you enjoy it. It's because it's helping the world.
I gotta tell you, if I'm being honest, like my why is making the lives of those that want to harm our community a little bit more difficult, making it a little harder, creating more friction for those that want to harm the Jewish community is my why. My why now is that I'm not done.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect way to close out, I think. Excellent. So, thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of Precinct 44. A really special thank you to you, Oren, for coming on. I know you're extremely busy, particularly with everything going on in the world. And I just really appreciate you sharing your expertise and, just the long-standing commitment that you have to combating anti-Semitism and extremism in all its forms. Today's conversation reminds us that anti-Semitism is not just a historical problem. It's a present and evolving threat that requires awareness, vigilance, and strong partnerships between law enforcement and the communities we serve. Understanding the indicators, building trust with Jewish organizations, and investing in training and prevention are essential steps toward creating safer, more resilient neighborhoods. If you're a law enforcement professional interested in deepening your understanding, we encourage you to explore resources offered by ADL. Education is one of our most powerful tools in countering hate. Thank you for listening and for your continued dedication to public safety. Stay safe, stay informed, and join us next time on Precinct 444.
Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@NLEOMF.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.